Welcome back to Houston Car and Truck Accident Law with Hank Stout. I'm Abby, here with Hank Stout of Sutliff Stout, Injury and Accident Lawyers in Houston, Texas. Today is episode 9, and we are answering the question that decides almost every serious truck case before a lawsuit is even filed. What happens in the first 30 days after a wreck, and why does that window matter so much? So we are walking through the evidence a truck case lives or dies on: the black box, the ECM, the electronic logging device that records a driver's hours, the Dashcam, and the telematics feed, and how fast all of it can disappear. We will cover the spoliation letter that forces a trucking company to hold on to its data, how a Houston CR3 crash report and the port and I-45 freight angles fit in, and how federal rules and Texas HB 19 turn preserved data into proof. Everything here is legal information, not legal advice. So let's get into question 1. Someone hurt in an 18-wheeler crash has no idea that a clock started running the moment metal hit metal. Why is the first 30 days after a Houston truck wreck the window that decides the whole case?
The first 30 days are critical in a case because it helps you gather the evidence that's there. A lot of the electronic information that's inside the device of the trucking company will get written over constantly. And so if you don't preserve that evidence quickly afterwards, then it'll just get written over. The systems are designed to upload some information to the cloud, but typically it only uploads like the 8 seconds prior to the collision. And really what you want all day. We just had one where a guy had been driving on failing brakes all day long, and they only give us the time of the actual collision. And so we say, no, we want the whole thing. We want the whole day. And so the judge made him go and download the device. And then we have audio and video of the driver actually calling his boss saying, hey, my brakes are failing. What do you want me to do? And the boss tells him to finish his runs and then come back. And so that type of evidence will go away or get written over if you don't have it preserved. And so as a lawyer, the first 30 days are very important to set a good foundation for your claim to make sure that you can make that liability showing.
A family assumes the evidence will simply be there when they are ready to deal with it. So what evidence actually disappears first after a truck accident?
The dash cam video, internal video, that's the evidence that disappears the quickest because it's a lot of data, it's bulky, and so they don't preserve it. They just write over the same hard drive over and over again inside that device. And so you want to remove the device from the vehicle to make sure it's not download or not continuing to record, and then you can download everything that's on there. And so you can get several days of data typically.
And how long is that black box data stored before the truck overwrites it?
So the actual ECM data from the 18-wheeler, it's the data from the engine, that stays there for a long time. That's not regularly written over. What you'll do is you'll compare the mile. So when you download it, there's a report that gives you the mileage and it'll tell you what's going on. And then you can download that information and have it. And it'll show if there's any other hard braking events. But that's what triggers the recording of that information. And so sometimes if there's not a hard braking event, then there may or may not be data on there. It just depends.
And if a victim has never heard the word spoliation and does not know it is the single most time-sensitive step in the case, what is a spoliation letter and why does it have to go out fast?
So in the state of Texas, the letter you need to send is actually called a preservation letter. And what a preservation letter does is it puts the other side on notice. Hey, I was injured as a result of your driver's negligence, and I was hurt, and so I anticipate making a claim, and as a result, you have a duty to preserve any evidence that is relevant to this incident. So that puts them on notice because in the state of Texas, you can file what's called a motion for spoliation to say that the defendant spoliated evidence. And what that really means is just a fancy way of saying that the defendants destroyed evidence that was bad for them. There are certain remedies that the court can give you depending on how bad or malicious the spoliation was. And so what the letter of preservation does is it puts them on notice because the first step in a spoliation claim is that the defendant had to have notice of the claim and that they must anticipate litigation because that's what triggers the duty to preserve evidence. You don't have to send a preservation letter, but it makes the spoliation claim much easier because you have then a written document that says, hey, I told you a day after the collision that I'm going to sue you and that you need to preserve this evidence, and you didn't. And so you knew you had an obligation to do it, and you disregarded that obligation. And then that allows the court to see, was this spoliation intentional or not?
So we know the clock is short. Next, let us open up the data sources themselves. So the black box, the ECM, the ELD, and the telematics, and what each one actually records. So a listener keeps hearing these three terms and used interchangeably and cannot tell them apart. So people hear black box, ECM, ELD. What is the difference and what does each one record?
So electronic control module is an ECM. It's really the same thing as a black box. And so those two terms are interchangeable. What's on your car is different than what's in a commercial truck. They record similar data, but the devices are different. One's usually out of your airbag, and that's in the passenger car. And the other is typically a device or a recording device that's in the engine. And that's a commercial truck. But what they show you is they show you braking, they show you speed, they show you throttle, they show you the turning of the steering wheel occasionally. And all of that information is extremely valuable, right? For instance, in a head-on collision, you're looking at who was turning the steering wheel. You know which way, you have the geometry of the road, and you can place the vehicles on the road. You know where the end collision point was, but oftentimes with the disparity in the mass between the truck and a car, you may not know who left the lane first because there may not be any witnesses, there may not be video, and the vehicles all ended up off the road. And so you can take that data and say, okay, this is the type of angle you should have on your steering wheel to navigate this roadway. And this person had a greater degree of steer input, and therefore they are probably the ones that left the lane of travel and came into the wrong. And so that's the way you take that data and then apply it to the physics of the collision, and you can map it all out with an accident reconstructionist. The ELDs, or electronic logs, that kind of gives you information related to how long they were on duty, where they were coming from, how fast they were going. Those devices also typically will have cameras associated with them. So you're going to get an outward facing camera on the roadway and an inward facing camera into the cab. And so that'll show you what the driver was doing just prior to the collision.
So if someone is told that the truck driver was not speeding, but they want to see if it can actually be proven, does that truck's black box record speed and braking in the seconds before the crash?
Oftentimes, depending on the year of the truck, the device that was in there. So each truck will record different devices. It's not standardized across the industry, but yes, there's ways that you can get at that data to determine the speed. In addition to the engine recording the speed, or the RPMs and other things, your ELDs will use GPS to calculate your speed. And so that is another place that you can look to see how fast they were going, because it generally will ping every half second. And so using that, you can take the positioning of where they were, and you then can calculate the speed of how long it took to get to point A to point B.
And a victim might understand that data exists, but cannot picture how a download turns it into proof of fault. So how is the data used to actually prove who was at fault?
So typically when you use the data, you're going to hire an accident reconstructionist, because those are typically the people that are qualified to do these downloads. And then your accident reconstructionist is going to take the data and dump it into some software, and they're going to reconstruct the collision that can tell you what the actions of each person were prior to the collision. And so that helps you show, was this person's actions reasonable or unreasonable? I just had a case where a truck driver blew through a stop sign, and we pulled the ECM data and the data from the truck, and it showed that he never hit the brakes. He never slowed down. He just kept going. They still wanted to try to argue that even though the truck ran the stop sign, that my guy, because he hit the back of the trailer, was also at fault for the collision because he failed to react in a timely fashion. And so in that case, we were able to take the download of our driver and show, no, in fact, based on the perception reaction time, he reacted in an appropriate manner because he started applying the brakes, and this is how much vision he would have seen the truck come into play, and this is how much time he would have had. And based on that amount of time, everything he did was reasonable. And so that was very helpful in that instance to be able to show that our driver didn't do anything wrong. And in fact, it was just the 18-wheeler who was responsible.
A family might be stunned to learn the evidence that could prove their case is sitting in the hands of a company they are up against. So, who owns the black box and the logging data after a crash, the victim or the trucking company?
It's the trucking company's data. And the only way you can force them to give it to you is by filing a lawsuit and then through the legal process, issuing a subpoena or discovery request, then you can go get that data. But that's how it works. So it's not your data. You don't have access to it. The police can force the companies to give it to them. Most people, after a fatality, generally the police will ask the company to give them data. Companies will cherry pick the data that they give the police. And so it's better to just get a lawyer so that you can use your own legal process and you can force them to give you what you want.
Someone is worried the case is lost because the truck was repaired and the black box may already be wiped. Can GPS and telematics data fill the gaps when the black box is gone?
So generally, ECMs do not get wiped. They can get replaced. They can get downloaded and improperly downloaded, and that can erase the information. There are other sources of information that you can glean similar information from. And that's mainly the ELDs are going to be based on GPS. And so you can calculate a speed through that. Most of them already have the functionality in the software to tell you what the speed of the vehicle was. So that's another location of it. But that's how it all works. And so you can use time and distance to determine speed.
So we have walked the data sources end to end. Now let us talk about what happens when a company is told to preserve all of this and does not, and what a real investigation looks like in those first days on the ground in Houston. So a victim cannot believe the other side is allowed to control and possibly erase the very evidence that proves the case. Can a trucking company legally delete or wipe the black box data?
So a company has an obligation to preserve evidence once it can reasonably anticipate litigation. And so in your more significant crashes, let's say your fatalities, it's really hard for a company to say, I didn't anticipate litigation. Most of them say that we anticipated litigation as soon as the collision happened, because the truth of it is while the victim's family is burying their loved one or making arrangements to bury their loved one, the trucking company is sending out lawyers and their own experts to document evidence to try to prove why they're not responsible. And that can be a really tough pill to swallow because you now have been forced to address all of these horrible things that you never thought you would have to deal with. And you then have to start preserving and gathering up evidence for a claim, which is why I tell people it's always better in that situation to hire a lawyer right away. Let the lawyer handle all of that for you. If you wait until after a certain period of time or things of that nature to go ahead and hire a lawyer, all the evidence from the scene is gone. Things are getting written over. They're putting vehicles back into service. There's all these bad things that can happen, which you can prevent by hiring a lawyer and then having the lawyer send out the letter of rep and the preservation notice, and then even filing a lawsuit quickly. You can get an injunction that we sometimes will go out and file what's called a temporary injunction or temporary restraining order to prevent a company from altering evidence until we have a chance to inspect.
And I think we want to know what a good preservation demand actually covers so nothing slips through. What exactly does that letter demand the trucking company hold on to?
So when you send a preservation letter, you want to know what all trucking companies generally have to have. And then you want to make it broad enough to include systems that they may or may not have. You have to have ELDs, but some people just have an app and they don't have video. You still want your preservation letter to be broad enough to include the video, both external video of the roadway and internal video of the cab. In your preservation letter, you don't want to just ask for the video related to the collision because there may be more evidence that's relevant. You may need the entire day. What was going on before? How was he distracted? What was he doing? You can see he may have been on his cell phone. He's going to say that's the only time he ever did it. It's the first time. The video for the day before showing that he was on his phone 100 different times is also great evidence to show that it's a pattern and practice of what the person was doing. And being very broad and then understanding the type of evidence that a trucking company is required to keep based on the federal motor carrier regulations is very important. And so you want to be very broad and cover all aspects of what documentation they're required to have.
A victim wants to know whether there is any real penalty when a company ignores the warning and wipes the data anyway. What happens in a Houston courtroom to a trucking company that destroys evidence after being warned?
So if you send a company a preservation letter, and let's say that they intentionally delete the video of the collision, then Texas law has formulated ways to undo that harm or try to fix the harm. And typically it can be done by death penalty sanctions, which are rare, meaning the court says you automatically lose on liability since you deleted this video. But there's other things they can do. They can give us what's called a spoliation instruction. So they'll tell the jury that the defendant had access to this video, then they allowed it to be deleted or deleted it. And so you should presume that the reason they deleted it is because the video was bad for them. And so that tells a jury that not only what they did was wrong, but also that the video was bad for them and they knew it and that they deleted it anyways. And so that can be very beneficial because it makes jurors mad at the company because they're trying to hide something. It's typically the cover up that gets you in trouble the most.
Someone might assume that hiring a lawyer means a few calls get made and then the evidence is handled. But why does a truck wreck in Houston take a rapid response investigation, not just a phone call in those first days?
In a significant trucking case, when we're hired in relative close time to when the collision happens, we're going to hire an accident reconstructionist. We're going to send somebody to the site. The sooner we can do that in relation to time to the collision, the better, because then there's going to be evidence on the ground. We found evidence on the ground and then we can preserve it. And in like tire blowout cases, we had a case where a tire blew out and we're trying to identify what tire it is and why it happened. The more pieces or tire remnants that you have, the better it is, right? And that evidence eventually will get thrown away, run over, destroyed. And so you want to preserve that. Also, nearby video surveillance is always constantly being rewritten over. And so we want to go to those stores around. We want to look, do you have surveillance? Can we have it? Can we keep it? Can we preserve it? Don't let it get written over. Same thing with sending the preservation letters. You can force a defendant to try to save stuff, or at least you can put them on notice that they have to save it. But if it's not a party, they have no obligation to save anything. And so as a lawyer, you need to be out there with your investigators or going out yourself, asking these people for this data so that it doesn't get destroyed.
A victim has heard an expert will be involved, but cannot picture what that person actually produces. So what does an accident reconstructionist do with the data once it is preserved?
So an accident reconstructionist takes all of the available evidence. They help you put the puzzle together to show what happened, right? So what you're trying to do is a recreation of the collision to show, okay, this is how the collision occurred. This is what this driver did. And then based on all of this evidence, this is what we believe would be a reasonable response, and this is an unreasonable response. And so that's what an accident reconstructionist does. And they take this scientific data that can be complicated and convoluted and try to synthesize it to put it in plain English to explain to the jury, hey, this is what happened and this is why it happened.
Is dashcam footage from inside the truck admissible as evidence?
Absolutely. Dash cam video of the moments just prior to the collision are admissible. And dash cam video from the day earlier in the day can be admissible. It just depends, how is it related, right? How is it relevant? Does it lead to making a fact more true than not true? And so that's what the judge will have to consider when they're considering whether or not they're going to admit any particular piece of evidence.
So preservation, sanctions, and reconstruction get the evidence and protect it. Now let us bring it home to Houston, the crash report, the carrier records, the federal leverage, and how Texas trial law decides what a jury finally sees. So a victim does not even know who the trucking company is, let alone how to find their insurance. After a Houston truck crash, how do you even get the trucking company's insurance and carrier information early on?
So generally in Texas, the investigating officer will give you what's called an exchange of information form. It's a little kind of white piece of paper that says, hey, this is the at-fault driver and this is their insurance company. If you don't get that, then on the crash report, that data will also be there. And so that's one way. Oftentimes, if it was a leased driver or a driver who is just a contractor working for a different driver, then you may have multiple insurances. And so what you have to do is you have to get a qualified trucking lawyer to get involved. You file a lawsuit and then you start investigating to figure out, okay, were you driving under your DOT number or were you driving under someone else's DOT number? What does the bill of lading say? Who the carrier was? Then you have to subpoena that carrier and say, who is your insurance company? There's a whole bunch of different steps that you go through as a lawyer to try to figure out who all was involved and then who can be held accountable for what occurred.
Someone wants the official record of their crash, but has no idea where it comes from or what's in it. So how do you get a Houston CR3 crash report, and what does it tell you?
Sure. The easiest way to get it is to call us. We're happy to get it for you for free. There's a system called the CRIS system in the state of Texas. They're public records, so you can get them for a fee. We're happy to get it for you for free and provide it to you and talk to you about it and tell you what all it means.
And then a victim might be surprised to hear federal rules actually give them an advantage against a trucking company. So why does federal regulation give a victim's lawyer extra leverage to demand this data?
It's not necessarily an advantage, but the federal rules require that trucking companies keep certain information. They also require that it be kept for a certain period of time. And so as a lawyer, your job is to tell the at-fault trucking company, hey, this claim occurred and this is relevant evidence that you must preserve. And if you don't, then we will seek sanctions or spoliation against you. And so that's where it allows good bookkeeping and good record keeping so that you can figure out what the trucking company was doing. And the difference between trucking companies and other companies is if other companies can choose to keep records or not, right? There's no legal obligation to do it. Whereas in the trucking industry, you have a obligation under the federal motor carrier regulations to keep certain data about drivers called a driver qualification file. You have to keep your safety training information. You have to keep what are called DVIRs, which is daily vehicle inspection reports. You have to keep your logs for a certain period of time. And so all of that information is super helpful as a lawyer to figure out what was happening, what was going on, and piece together the puzzle to show why the driver was responsible, why the company was irresponsible, and what the company should have done different and how that could have changed the outcome.
Someone has heard Texas change the rules for trucking lawsuits and worries it weakens their case. So Texas HB 19 changed how trucking trials work. Does it affect how the evidence gets used?
The change in the law essentially made it where you have a bifurcated trial. And so certain claims, negligent entrustment, negligent hiring, negligent training, negligent supervision, to the extent you have those claims, are now tried in the second phase. So in the first phase, you would have, was the driver responsible and what are the plaintiff's damages? And then in the second phase, where you're also seeking pecuniary damages or exemplary damages or what are called punitive damages, then you would put on the evidence as it relates to your negligent training, supervision, hiring, and negligent entrustment claims. And so it doesn't change the way in which evidence gets used. It just changes when you can use it. And so that's the main effect of the law.
A listener who has handled a fender bender cannot understand why a truck case is a completely different animal. Why are truck cases so much more evidence heavy than an ordinary car crash?
A trucking case just has access to much more information, right? You're trying to show the jury what the person did, how they did it, and why they're irresponsible. Instead of just a he said, she said, you have all this data that you can use to help the jury understand this is what they should have done, this is what they did, and this is why it's irresponsible. Because as a lawyer, I find that juries really want to understand why, right? You have two people that are arguing. One is seeking money, the other is saying they didn't do anything wrong. And then you have to figure out, okay, what happened? And so it empowers the jury to understand what the person did and why it was wrong. And as a lawyer, that's super helpful for me because jurors want to try to do the right thing, but you have to be able to give them the evidence so that they can figure it out for themselves.
Before we close, for someone who has just survived a truck wreck and is overwhelmed, what is the one thing you want them to remember about these first 30 days?
Contact a trucking lawyer. You give us a call. We're happy to give you a free consultation and tell you if we can help. A qualified trucking lawyer will know exactly what needs to be done. And then that way you can focus on getting better, treating your injuries, And you can rest assured that the lawyer is taking care of what needs to be taken care of as it relates to preserving evidence and documenting your case and making sure your claims have a good foundation upon which to rest.
If you or someone you love was hurt in a truck wreck in Houston, the evidence that proves your case is disappearing right now, and the trucking company already knows it. So call Sutliff Stout Injury and Accident Lawyers at 713-987-7111 or visit sutliffstout.com for a free consultation. The sooner you call, the more of your case can still be saved. Thanks for listening to Houston Car and Truck Accident Law with Hank Stout. Everything we covered today is legal information and not legal advice.